try to throw it out.
Well, I've been studying Andy Warhol interviews, so they're all going to be yes and no answers.
Please don't do that. So, it's a general question I ask most of the people who read here, just to get started and thinking a little bit about form. Well, first of all, let me ask you this. How often do you write a free verse poem?
I'm sorry?
How often do you write a free verse poem?
Very infrequently.
So, I guess my question is about that. Well, why, how conscious of a decision is it to write in form?
It's not really a conscious decision, I just love doing it. I mean, writing in form for me takes me places that I wouldn't get to on an open piece of paper, just writing what occurs to me. I mean, I'm challenged constantly. It's a great paradox, really, that restriction frees you, and the constriction frees you. And it's always taking me places that are better than I think I would have gotten to otherwise. Also, I think form is beautiful. I don't write always rhyming, but you know, the aspects of form are beautiful. I'm a traditionalist. I'm a real old-fashioned kind of guy. I also find free verse extremely difficult to write. I love free verse. I've got no prejudice against free verse. I find it difficult to write. Now, there's one free verse poem in Coelacanth, and I've written others, but...
So, I'm going to ask some more questions about that, but I also want to go back to something else. You're a painter.
Yeah.
What came first? Painting, poetry?
Well, poetry came first in college, and then journalism came, which was a way to get paid, and I stopped writing poetry. So then painting came, and then poetry came again. And I think really, when I look over the whole thing, I would say painting came first. The poetry in college was nothing like what I'm involved with now. It came really later. So really painting came first.
That is an interesting trajectory. Poetry and sort of journalism kills poetry, and then painting sort of reignites poetry. Is that?
I just want something to kill journalism. It's just like, it takes too long to die. Yeah, but yeah, you know, the thing is that these things aid each other. Number one, I get so many great ideas for poems as a journalist. You know, my anti-science poems come from the fact that I write for the American Chemical Society. I'm not a chemist, I'm a journalist. But, you know, poetry to me is most like cinema than any other art form. It's a visual art form, and painting and poetry feed off each other. One strange thing is when I went back to poetry, I stopped painting really, other than maybe once or twice a year for years. And then I came back to painting seriously again, and it's almost better than I had never stopped, like I'd actually advanced, and I think it has to do with the eye, the image. It's just the creative, transferable creative activity.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is the relation between those. I want to ask you something about writing these big, long, huge things. At what point did you realize with Hunky that you were writing a book-length poem?
That one happened in a ridiculous way. I wrote a sonnet as practice, and then, as I said, as that part that I read explained, I really wasn't really crazy about going. I had a good time and, you know, learned a few things. I wrote this sonnet, and I said, well, why don't I make a short, funny poem about not wanting to go? And then I put it on Erratosphere, one of the critique boards, and people liked it, and I said, you know what? Don't stop, you know, and I just wrote canto after canto, and that one came along pretty quickly. Soutine was different. Oddly, Hunky, who I knew nothing about, I studied not at all and wrote the book. Wow. Soutine, who I was immersed in, I really spent time studying, because I had to get a lot more of this sort of chronology and find out, reread books that people have written about and that kind of thing. So they were different. And
so, similar question about Soutine. I mean, did you set about to write this big long thing, or did you start in some smaller way?
No, Soutine, I knew right off the bat that you know, I had this story inside me. You know, and it took about a year to write it. Hunky took like 10 weeks to write, a week or something like that. But Soutine took it was a very intense year of writing. It's a long poem. But I just felt I had this story inside me, and I'm not surprised that it evoked the memoir stretches, because of the connection that I feel to this man who was someone like... Chaim Soutine in France was probably like Chico Marx in America. You know, his French was probably comparable to Chico Marx's English. He was from the shtetl. He was a Jew who was like in the lowest social rank in the shtetl. Came over, became a great artist, and you know, that story is so amazing. And it was within me, I think, to write something like that.
Yeah. So I'm just coming up to the Darwin stuff. I mean, so you're a science journalist. You have some contact with that, and done this research with Soutine. You do some research with Darwin. So how did that role play? I mean, if I'm a historian or scientist writing this, there's a certain kind of way I approach research. As a poet, I mean, poetry has to win out at some point, right?
Well, first of all, I should explain that at the American Chemical Society, I'm a business writer. You know, a lot of my colleagues are PhD chemists. They keep them at headquarters in Washington. They keep the business writers in New York. They keep us separated. You know, my little joke is I'd write about shoes if it paid more, but it's not a joke. So I'm not a scientist, although I've been writing, you know, science business. Darwin I've always felt that Darwin was abused, and that we're abused by people using Darwin as this voice of reason against the stupid religious people. You know, it's like he's completely confused. And I had to come to grips with Darwin to a certain extent. The idea for that book came from a week or a month in New York when there were 3 exhibits, one on Darwin, one on Van Gogh, and one on Whitman. And one day you can go to all 3 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the library, and at the Museum of Natural History. You can guess who was where. And I came up saying that, you know, Darwin's the odd man out because Van Gogh and Whitman, their big contribution was inserting the self into what they do, right? But then I said, no, Darwin is that too. You know, Darwin is a scientist who broke rules, a scientist who challenged himself, received learning, and was in tune with nature in the same way that Whitman and Van Gogh were, especially when he was younger. And I had leafed around through the Voyage of the Beagle, and sometimes it was like a cartoon my kids watched. I forget what it was called, but there was like a family on safari. The father was English, and everyone else was American for some reason, at least their accents. And they were always bumbling into like meeting, you know, people all over the world. And I said that this is kind of funny like that. Of course, it's very serious, and I finally read the thing. And I realized that, you know, you could write that some of his paragraphs had voltas, you know, these things could really be portrayed as sonnets. And I meshed my voice with his and tried to find him in writing this group of sonnets. Again, it's a completely different, you know, project than was either Hunky or Soutine.
Yeah. Except maybe that's the thread, like what the poet has to offer to that kind of a work is just that identity, that identification.
Exactly, the personal involvement. I mean, I'm actually a character, essentially, in Soutine. Someone in the audience. I'm in the memoir bits. In Hunky, I'm the character. In Soutine, I'm in the memoir bits. And, you know, in Darwin, it's his voice and mine. You know, where I am Darwin. You know, basically, I'm Darwin. But sometimes I'm consciously sort of revealing Darwin's foibles and faults and trying to portray his greatness as well. There, I can't say that I'm sharing with him. But, you know, that's what I think the poet does here. And I really not sure I have the exact answer, but the poet tries to share his own, as any artist does. Art to me is creativity. Creativity is a matter of response to nature and a giving of oneself and portrayal of experience. So I'm portraying my experience of Darwin. That's what the poet does, I think, when they do these things.
Well, you just said